Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Today we're looking at 3 chilling, true taxi driver horror stories. We're gonna see the completely unpredictable, high-stakes danger that frontline public transport workers face every single day. I mean, we're talking about instances where the totally mundane, seemingly harmless act of picking up a passenger, well, it turned into an absolute nightmare.
Who is really getting into your backseat? You know, it seems like an incredibly simple question, right? But it highlights this jarring, sudden shift from the reality of everyday gig work to extreme, life-threatening danger. Think about it. Drivers routinely navigate their day with zero control over who enters their workspace, literally none. One minute you're just chatting about the weather, and the very next you realize you've let a total stranger with completely unknown intentions sit right behind your head.
Because sometimes the true horror isn't, a monster in a movie. It's the paying customer sitting 2 feet behind you. Just take a look at this chilling confession from our first case study. The attacker simply wanted to know, quote, what it felt like to watch the life drain from someone's eyes and feel their warm blood. I mean, wow. It is entirely visceral, and it instantly establishes the sheer life or death stakes we are dealing with here.
Case Study 1. The Thrill Killer. An Isolated Trap. This first story takes us to rural Australia, and honestly, what makes it so chilling is just how totally normal it begins. Our driver picks up a young kid wearing a black hoodie from a familiar local community pub, just a regular Friday night. They drive past the last of the houses, heading deep into isolated bushland, until the kid simply asks the driver to pull over and turn off the engine so they can talk. Now, the terrifying motive at play here, it's something called thrill killing. Basically, it's a violent act motivated purely by dark excitement or curiosity. It's completely devoid of any personal malice, which somehow makes it even scarier. So, trapped inside that confined cab, the situation escalates incredibly fast. First comes the confession. The kid just calmly admits to having those dark thoughts about wanting to feel warm blood. And then, literally with a smile on his face, he pulls a knife from his hoodie and lunges forward right between the seats, just slashing and stabbing wildly at the driver. In a desperate, split-second bid for survival, the driver actually leans forward to dodge the blade, reaches under his seat, and pulls out a handgun he kept for emergencies. He ends up shooting the attacker right before the kid could finish him off. Now, the aftermath of this is just incredibly heavy. The bleeding driver did manage to run to a nearby house for help, and thankfully he survived. The police eventually ruled the whole incident as clear self-defense. But, surviving physically doesn't mean you escape unharmed. The psychological toll here is just massive. The driver actually admits that this kid is basically just another ghost that follows him around now. It constantly leaves him wondering why on earth he didn't just take that Friday night off.
All right, moving on to Case Study 2, The Coerced Getaway, a 1980s Liverpool hit. I want you to transport yourself back to a dark, super quiet street in Liverpool. It's about 10 p.m. in the 1980s. A driver who's just trying to make some extra money for his family gets called for a pickup. But the absolute second the passenger gets in, any illusion of control completely vanishes. The guy is wearing a balaclava, he's carrying a literal jerry can of petrol, and he's pointing an old 6-shooter right at the driver. He immediately tells the driver that if he tries to run or even upsets him, he's a dead man. So the threat here is just immediate and overwhelming.
Under this terrifying threat of death, the driver is forced to take a really harrowing route. First stop, a pub on Upper Parliament Street. The passenger just sits there watching the doors like a hawk. Then, right around closing time, as people start filing out, the killer rolls down the window and pulls the trigger. The driver described the victim hitting the concrete like a wet sack of spuds. It's awful. Then, with that same gun pressed directly to the back of the driver's head, he screams at him to drive to a derelict area near the airport. Once they finally pull into this abandoned area, the killer empties that petrol he brought all over the seats, sets the poor guy's taxi on fire, and just runs off into the darkness. Our driver is left standing there entirely alone, forced to walk to a payphone just to call the police. But here is the most terrifying part of the whole story. The killer was never caught. Never. And to this day, the driver says he still has these horrible dreams where he's begging the killer to reconsider, but no matter what he says, the killer never, ever listens.
And that brings us to Case Study 3, The Extremist Bomber, a Diverted Target. For this final story, we're heading over to the UK with a cabbie named Dave. So, it's Remembrance Sunday, and Dave picks up a fare. The passenger gets in, and he's carrying a really heavy backpack. Initially, the guy asks to go to the local cathedral for the Sunday services. Simple enough, right? But they hit some really bad traffic. Dave, just being a helpful guy, suggests the man walk the rest of the way so he doesn't miss the service. But the passenger totally ignores him. Instead, he just stares out the window at this massive building and suddenly demands to be dropped off at the women's hospital.
Now, Dave immediately senses that something is deeply, deeply wrong here. Even without knowing exactly what that something was, his pure, split-second survival instinct kicks in. What does he do? He quietly locks the cab's doors. He literally traps the passenger inside so the guy couldn't just jump out without giving an explanation for this weird, sudden detour to a hospital.
As soon as they pull up to the hospital, the passenger realizes he's locked in, so he reaches into his bag and detonates a homemade bomb. I mean, the explosion blew all the windows out and absolutely destroyed the car. But somehow, by an absolute miracle, Dave actually stumbles out of that burning wreckage alive. He only suffered some permanent hearing damage and a clipped ear. The bomber, however, was killed instantly in the flames. Later on, police discovered that the passenger was actually an extremist who was specifically targeting the maternity hospital to maximize the tragedy. Dave locking those doors, that split-second decision literally saved countless lives that day.
Section 4. The psychological toll, the unseen burden of the front line.
You know, when we talk about driving or gig work, we almost never talk about the lingering psychological trauma. Just consider the lasting aftermath of the 3 events we just looked at. Case 1 leaves a driver with physical stab wounds and this haunting regret over taking a simple Friday night shift. Case 2 leaves a man with unending nightmares, where he's begging a faceless killer. And Case 3, it leaves Dave with permanent hearing damage from a literal bomb blast. It really proves that even when these drivers survive the shift and physically make it home, they are still carrying those horrors with them. The scars are absolutely permanent.
Which brings us to our final thought for today. When a total stranger essentially holds your life in their hands, how do you ever truly clock out? The immense vulnerability hidden within these everyday service jobs is just astounding. So the next time you step into a cab or a rideshare, maybe take a quick moment to realize the absolute trust that driver is placing in you just by unlocking their door. Thank you so much for joining me for this Explainer, friends. And hey, remember to click that notification bell. See you next time.